I have the honor of hosting this science panel. Let me welcome Dr. Erin Macdonald, Dr. Mohamed Noor, Andre Bormanis, Naren Shankar, and do we call you Dr. Bob Picardo? Actor Bob Picardo? We got Bob Picardo with us, crashing the party. Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Of course. Let me start with this, because we've only got 20 minutes and a lot of ground to cover. So this is for Erin, Mohamed, Andre, and Naren. Go back in time for me, each of you. What was your Star Trek entry point? And did the show turn you onto science, or did it stoke a flame that was already lit?
You want to go first, Erin?
Ladies first.
Sure. All right. Yeah, for me, I didn't really discover Star Trek myself as a fan until I was in college and already studying astrophysics. And that's because in the Venn diagram of Star Trek fans and physics majors, there's a big overlap. And so we would watch Star Trek during our parties and homework sessions. And that's really where the love grew. And then, we graduated. I went off to graduate school. I didn't know anyone, and I just kind of dove headfirst into Star Trek. So I was already into the science, but Star Trek kind of kept that flame alive for sure.
Mohamed?
So for me, I found Star Trek as a kid. I wasn't alive when the first series aired, but I found it as a kid. I saw an episode at a friend's house, and I was just immediately drawn in. I already did like science. I don't think I would say either one preceded the other. I feel like they both kind of came together, but what I really loved is they reinforced each other. And through my time in college, I would often in science classes talk about things from Star Trek with friends from Star Trek who were associated with Star Trek, talk about science concepts. So I felt like they just reinforced it.
Andre?
I got interested in astronomy when I was probably 6 or 7 years old. And when I was 7, the original series premiered. So dating myself, obviously, for those of you who can do the math. And my older brother watched Star Trek. I didn't understand it. I remember watching in fact, I think I saw the original airing of The Naked Time, the first season episode. And I didn't understand it, but I was mesmerized. But I didn't really start to watch Star Trek, the original series, until it was running in syndication in the 70s when I was in high school. And I was already, on the path to becoming an astronomer and, very interested in science. So it was a natural fit for me. And of course, had a lot of friends who were Trekkies and read the book, The Making of Star Trek, which was out at the time. And that was like, oh my God, this sounds so fun, making TV shows. So it's weirdly, I never expected to be involved in working on a Star Trek series because I never figured there'd be another one back then. And strangely, I've ended up becoming very involved in the Star Trek universe.
Right. Naren?
Well, I saw the original series when I was a kid, and maybe weirdly, like Scotty was my favorite character. And so I think that kind of, geared me, put me on the path to being an engineer. And, that was maybe my natural inclination. I devoured science fiction when I was a kid. And, I started as an art student in college, and then I transferred into engineering, and I stayed there through graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, I started moving back into history and literature and things that I initially loved. And so when I came out, I decided I didn't want to be an engineer anymore. And I wound up, I went to school with Ron Moore, and he said, come out to LA and be a screenwriter. And so I wound up on Star Trek as an intern and then became a science consultant for Star Trek. And so I had this bizarrely circular path. And that was my in.
Huh? Now, Bob, was science on your radar before Voyager, or did being on the show get you interested in it?
Oh, no, I was science way predated my interest in Star Trek. I love biology, took advanced biology in high school, went to Yale as a biology major, and had acted for fun, sort of as a hobby. And then I was in a production of the Bernstein Mass at Yale that made me decide to try being an actor. So I love science, but what Star Trek did for me, and I was not a Star Trek fan until I was cast on Voyager. I made this confession to the fan base. They know all of this. In fact, when I got out of Yale, I roomed with 2 philosophy majors from Yale who watched Star Trek in reruns every afternoon, and I made pitiless fun of them for doing it.
So I was not only not a Star Trek fan, I made fun of Star Trek fans, but I have lived to eat those words. When I got cast on Voyager, they gave me a bunch of next-gen medical-heavy episodes. I watched them. I loved the storytelling, and I became a Star Trek fan working on it. And Star Trek brought me back to science because of all the incredible people I've met through Star Trek who were doing the real work in science. All of the principal investigators at JPL, all of the astronauts I've met, that it brought me back. And my work with the Planetary Society has made me love science again. So I keep thinking that because life science was my initial interest, then Star Trek came. Star Trek brought me back to life science. Before I leave this planet, I am going to discover, along with all of humanity, life off this planet. So that's the goal. We've got to find even microbial life evidence on Mars before I'm on the wrong side of the grass.
There you go. All right, for each of you, and this is going to open a can of worms, what on the science front has Star Trek gotten right? And what is, to this point, so far light years removed from the slightest possibility of ever being real?
I'll jump in on this one because I personally, my PhD was in general relativity and gravitational astrophysics. So for me, warp drive being mathematically possible is awesome. and the fact that we are now directly detecting gravitational waves, which is the actual motion of space-time itself, the next step for humanity is to then learn how to manipulate it. And we're still a ways off from that because we're going to require a ton of energy to be able to do that. But just the fact that warp drive is mathematically possible gets me pretty excited.
Yeah. Somebody else want to jump in on that?
I'll say for the genetic side, Star Trek, generally speaking, especially when you're thinking about simple genetics terms like dominance, recessivity, use of DNA for figuring out ancestry, it tends to do pretty well. It tends to be pretty accurate. And it seems to track the knowledge of the time. So as you get to modern series like Star Trek Discovery, they talk about epigenetics, there's mitochondrial DNA, horizontal gene transfer, and they use all the terms correctly. On the other side, I'd probably have to say threshold and evolving into a salamander.
I know. Is that anti-science or anti?
No, that's
everything else.
We had a lot
to see. You're right.
We had a lot of arguments about that on Next Generation. By the way, we had a lot of arguments about that, but I was not on board.
That was a Brandon Braga fever dream, which
it was indeed
an entertaining episode in its own strange way, but yeah. Warp 10 and evolution.
Yikes.
But okay. I think we kind of made up for it with symbiogenesis in Voyager, which Bob Picardo was an important part of that episode. That was a lot of fun. Tuvix. Interesting idea, fairly advanced idea that I don't think has ever been explored in any other 1-hour television drama before or since. So, but yeah, I will go out on a limb and say transporters never happen. Never going to have transporters.
Yeah, really? I would agree with all of those things. I think the show got a ton of technology right. From cellular phones like the original Motorola StarTAC, non-invasive imaging. I mean, all of from the original series on. I mean, we used to make fun of the backlit graphics on Next Generation because we were like, oh, this is never going to work. Who's never going to? There are no buttons. This is ridiculous. And now we're all using iPads, and it's like, so it's so I think the show was very pressing in many ways.
And then I'm going to keep my can of worms open and ask about the Enterprise and Voyager actually being able to fly. Forget about warp drive for a second. The shape of the ships. Could they fly or would they be doing this?
You mean an atmosphere or?
It's a question I've seen fans debate online for as long as the internet has existed, to be honest with you. And I remember people debating it when I saw Gene Roddenberry at a convention when I was a teenager in the 80s. They were asking about it.
The saucer,
they would drop like stones.
Yeah, but the saucer section of the Enterprise could conceivably glide through the atmosphere. I mean, it would have to have thrust. I mean, you couldn't just throw it like a frisbee. That would be crazy. Similarly with Voyager, if it's ability to kind of neutralize gravity, we're offline. Would it aerodynamically be able to fly through an atmosphere with its thrusters, doubtful, but they're not designed to do that.
No.
So for you guys as scientists and writers, where do you draw the line and say, okay, look, somewhere this is a story. We're telling science fiction. We got to show the ship flying. It doesn't matter if it can't fly. What's that like as a scientist? Where do you draw the line and say, all right, I'm going to shut up now. I've made my point. This is a show. Take me through that for each of you.
For me, it happens pretty often.
I very, very rarely encountered.
No, I was just going to say like that, that happens pretty often where most of the times my role is to say, let's not explain something, that you're going to be digging yourself a bigger hole if you're going to start trying to explain what you're doing. If there is scientific backbone that we can include in it, then that's great. And then, of course, there are times where the science doesn't work. So one, you don't explain it. Don't even try to explain it. And two, story every time, 100% of the time takes precedence over the science. And so it's about the characters. It's about the story. The science can drive it, but if they're in conflict with each other and you have a good story, then the story has to win out.
Yeah. The type of show you're working on also determines a lot of that. Like, Star Trek has a different bar than For All Mankind did or than The Expanse did for me. Like, those shows were very, very different in how they treated science and how they were required to treat science just because of the way stories were told in those worlds. Star Trek probably leans a little bit more on, as Erin was describing it, like it's sort of, what we need to have happen is like, okay, and let's maybe not talk about the things that might happen for real.
But it does more than a lot of shows. I mean, the example is the other extreme would be like The Flash, or like, okay. They don't even try.
You have to remember that, Star Trek is 400 or some odd years in the future, and there are going to be a lot of discoveries between now and then that make that Star Trek universe possible. There would have to be, obviously, if you have warp drive and so on. But I always, I found that I very rarely had to, find a way to put the kibosh on something. And when I did, it was always, I will give them an alternative and I will explain kind of my reasoning. And it was pretty rare. And they usually understood that, oh yeah, having Picard, take a kayak through a lava tube down to the core of a Class M planet is probably ridiculous, and that's, it's Jules Verne. And for a lot of reasons, that's not a good B story. But I always, looked at analogies. So we had an episode of Next Gen where they had to reheat the core of a Class M planet because it was cooling too rapidly and causing all of these earthquakes and so on. And I'm like, well, that's crazy. Come on. Core of a planet, several thousand miles in diameter, iron and nickel. How are you going to heat that up in any reasonable, period of time? And I thought, well, 100 years ago, somebody would have said, if somebody had said, I can throw a handful of invisible particles into this big pile of metal, and it'll raise the temperature of that pile of metal by hundreds of degrees in a matter of hours, they'd say you're crazy. Well, that's how a nuclear pile works, nuclear fission. So we have these fictional particles in our phaser banks called nations, which I think was a Mike Okuda, Rick Sternbach sort of a term. So I said, okay, for the purposes of this episode, the nations have the property that if you blast them into the core of a Class M planet, there are elements within the core of that planet that will fission, and a la a nuclear chain reaction, it will propagate, and voila, in a day or two, you'll warm up the core of the planet sufficiently to stop the earthquakes.
All right. And Bob, you had loads and loads of medical speak and technobabble. Did you have to understand any of it to deliver your lines, or did that not matter?
I asked a lot of questions. Early on, my first big question was, how does a hologram handle real instruments? How is this projection of light, handling real objects in sickbay? And of course, they gave me some gobbledygook about how it's transporter theory, the magnetic containment field that creates the illusion of everything had the word reconfigure or modulated in it. So I got the first.
My two favorite words.
The baloney. That was the baloney explanation of how I could handle real objects. Later on, when I found out that the doctor had a child on a planet in one episode, I did ask Brandon Braga why you would make an emergency medical hologram anatomically correct. What kind of emergency medical procedures are you envisioning? That seemed odd to me but I guess that was, because the doctor, being a full-fledged individual, he had hobbies as well. He didn't have to sing opera. Apparently, he was anatomically correct if the right opportunity presented itself. So there were all sorts of questions I asked that were not really good answers. But the great thing about those long speeches of technobabble I had is that they followed the laws of the language of scientific reasoning. So even the parts that were made up, it still said, here's the hypothesis that I'm testing. Here's how I'm going to test it, all of that. And I remembered enough from my biology studies that sense of how to speak, to use that kind of scientific language, that they really did follow that, even though there were giant gaps in between the various stages of what I was saying. There were huge leaps. At least the nature of the language seemed very scientific and correct in structure.
Great. We've got 4 minutes left, and I've got 2 questions that I want to make sure we get to, one of which is very important. We're all here for the Hollywood Food Coalition to support that. And I'm wondering, in what ways do you think science can help solve or mitigate the world's food crisis?
Oh, in so many ways. So things like, for example, genetic studies that try to make more drought-resistant rice, so that much more of it can be grown in areas of the planet where it couldn't be grown. It's just one example. But yeah, definitely science is vital for this sort of thing. Finding other ways of transporting food and keeping it fresh. Good pesticides so that again they're not, the crops are not being hurt. Yeah, so many ways.
Everybody else want to jump in on there?
Oh, plant-based foods, engineered meats. I mean, these are the things that are, these are the things that are going to be sustainable, because the current state of agriculture in this planet is not sustainable in any sense.
Yeah, I grew up in Arizona, and it's long past time to rethink whether it's a good idea to grow alfalfa in Arizona to feed cattle in Saudi Arabia. It's not so much a science question as it is a policy question, and that's got to be a part of the solution as well.
Absolutely.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? Or I'll ask the last question. Okay. So if other scientists want to get involved as consultants for science fiction shows or movies, how can they make that happen? How can they follow in your footsteps?
The most straightforward way is the National Academy of Sciences hosts a program called the Science and Entertainment Exchange. Yep. So if you just Google that, Science and Entertainment Exchange, National Academy of Sciences, you can go up there as a scientist. You can sign up for their newsletter. You can have an interview. And what their purpose is to connect creatives in the entertainment industry with practicing scientists so that questions come out. It's not all just about movies and TV shows. It's also authors and things like that as well. That's probably the most direct way.
Yeah, there's another way as well that I found was great at building my experience back when I got started. And there's a website called Coverfly that hosts screenplays for people to submit to competitions and things like that. But they have a program called Coverfly X where you can give notes on each other's screenplays, and it kind of works as an exchange service. But as a scientist, people are wanting their scripts read. And so you can go and search for sci-fi scripts and give notes from a science perspective. And that's a great way to learn how to read scripts, get used to storytelling, and really just get a lot of experience so you're confident when those opportunities do come up.
And people do this voluntarily.
Yeah. It's a lot. I mean, but I think for me, one of the things that I learned when I got started was it was so much about learning the story writing process and understanding how to yes and, how to give alternates, how to give dialogue changes that weren't going to bump the original intent and to not overstep your capability. It requires a lot. And I hope you like reading, because I read about 300 pages of scripts a week at least. So yeah, it's a lot.
Good deal. Well, everybody, that's our time. We are done. Thank you.
Don't forget to recommend that if you're a Star Trek fan or you're a space fan, please consider joining the Planetary Society.
Bob, we got 15 seconds. I'm leaving it to you. Sell the Planetary Society.
The Planetary Society, www.planetary.org. Bill Nye is our leader. It was co-founded by Carl Sagan, and I'm on the executive board and have worked with him for a quarter of a century, thanks to Star Trek.
There you go. Thank you, everybody.